"No one marries a fat girl, sir. But I can cook," said the bride. The rancher's reply changed her life. The sun hung low over the plains, casting long, jagged shadows across the weathered land. The wind was cold, biting, a reminder that winter was inching closer. A lone, forgotten cabin stood in the middle of the vast emptiness, its dark wood cracked and splintered by years of neglect. The only sound was the rhythmic creak of the door as it swung in the wind, a sound too haunting for something so simple. Inside, Eli Walker stood near the hearth, his hands calloused from years of hard labor. The cabin was sparse, almost painfully so, just a bed, a table, a chair, and the remnants of a life left behind by someone who no longer existed. His boots scraped across the floor as he moved to the window, his gaze drifting over the empty fields. There was no sign of life. Nothing but the dust of a forgotten world. Eli wasn't much of a man for company. Life had taught him that. War, betrayal, the silence of long nights. He had once been part of something larger, something filled with laughter and the smell of fresh bread. Now, all he had was the land, and the weight of memories that clung to him like an old, worn coat. Then came a sound that snapped him out of his trance, a soft, hesitant knock on the door. He hesitated. Who would come this far out? It wasn't the kind of place people visited willingly. Another knock, this time more insistent. Eli walked slowly to the door, the floor creaking under his weight. He opened it without a word. There she stood, a woman in a plain dress, her hair tucked under a faded bonnet. Her eyes, wide and unsure, met his. She wasn't exactly young, and she certainly wasn't a picture of beauty. Her face was plain, her figure full. But it was the sadness in her eyes that struck Eli first. She began, her voice faltering. "I need help. I've nowhere else to go." Eli studied her quietly, noting the way she shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. He didn't speak at first, not because he didn't care, but because he wasn't sure what to say. He hadn't expected a visitor, let alone a woman. "What's your name?" he finally asked, his voice rough. "Mary," she answered, her gaze dropping to the ground. He stood there for a long moment, weighing her words against the isolation that had become his life. But something about her, something unspoken, tugged at him. He stepped aside. "Come in, then," he said quietly. She nodded and stepped into the cabin, her movements stiff and uncertain. As she passed, the faint smell of something earthy and comforting, bread perhaps, lingered in the air. The wind howled outside, pressing against the cabin walls as though it wanted to tear them down. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the small room. Mary sat in the corner, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was drawn, her eyes distant. Eli watched her from his place by the fire, his thoughts as cold and hard as the land outside. She hadn't said much after she entered. She'd only looked around, her eyes darting to the small stove, the few pieces of worn furniture. She had sat down without a word and wrapped her arms around herself, as if trying to hold the pieces of her together. Every movement seemed to carry a weight, a burden too heavy for her slender shoulders. Eli watched her, the air thick with unspoken questions. She was silent, but it was a silence that screamed louder than words. He knew that kind of silence, the kind that came after too much pain, too many losses, too many goodbyes. He'd seen it in the eyes of men he had fought beside, the hollow look of someone who had been shattered and left to pick up the pieces alone. A flash of memory hit him. A young soldier, caked in mud, eyes wide with fear as though he lay in the dirt, waiting for something that might never come. His heart clenched, and he had to look away. The scars of war weren't just on his body. They were inside him, woven deep into the earth, fabric of his being. He hadn't asked for this life. He hadn't asked for the silence that followed him everywhere he went. But here was Mary, sitting in the same quiet sorrow that had once swallowed him whole. Her expression was different, softer perhaps, but the pain was the same. Her shoulders trembled slightly, as if she were holding back the flood of emotions that threatened to break free. And Eli recognized that hesitation. He had lived with it too, the fear of vulnerability, the shame that came with needing someone, He felt the temptation to walk away, to turn his back, to leave her to her fate, just as he had done so many times before. He didn't need another person to care for. He had enough of his own scars to deal with. He didn't want the responsibility. But then, his eyes met hers. For the first time, she looked up at him, her gaze filled with a quiet desperation, an unspoken plea for help. He saw it, her pain, and it felt like his own. He thought of the years spent alone, the nights that stretched on endlessly, the hollow ache of having no one, no family, no friends, no purpose, just the land and the ghosts of people he once cared about. Eli shifted, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. It was too late to walk away now. The choice had already been made the moment she walked into his life. He stood, his body stiff with the weight of it, and walked toward her. The room felt too small, the space between them too vast. "You can stay," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Mary looked up, surprised. A flicker of something, hope perhaps, passed through her eyes. Eli sat down beside her, the firelight casting soft shadows across his face. "I'm not much company, but I'll make sure you're safe, for now." Mary didn't respond, but she didn't need to. In that quiet exchange, something had shifted. The wall that had surrounded her cracked, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't alone. And neither was Eli. He had made his choice. He would help her. Days passed in silence, the kind of quiet that could settle into your bones. The fire always burned warm in the cabin, the steady crackle of wood breaking the stillness. Mary had found her place beside the hearth, cooking, cleaning, moving through the routine with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to live without being seen. Eli didn't ask about her past. The weight of his own silence made that clear. But something had changed. He'd begun to notice the small, subtle signs, the way her hands trembled when she touched a knife, the faraway look in her eyes whenever someone mentioned family, the way she flinched at loud noises. It wasn't just fear of the unknown. It was the kind of fear that came from being hunted, from knowing that someone was out there, someone who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. It was the third evening when the first clue came. Eli had returned from the far end of the land, his boots dragging from a long day of work, when he saw the smoke. At first, he thought it was just the haze from the firewood, but as he got closer, his stomach twisted. Mary was standing in the doorway, staring out into the distance, her face pale. Her eyes were fixed on something beyond the horizon, something that only she seemed to see. "They're coming," she said, her voice a ghost of a whisper. Eli's heart clenched, the air thick with tension. He had no need to ask who she meant. He could see it in the way she was standing, the way she had braced herself. The threat wasn't some fleeting thought in her mind, it was real. "The men who—" Her voice faltered and she swallowed hard before continuing. "They've come for me." Eli's gaze narrowed. He knew the kind of men she meant. A gang of ruthless cattle rustlers had been moving through the region for weeks, using their size and brutality to intimidate any who stood in their way. The rumors were enough to make even the toughest men tremble. Those who went missing weren't just dead. They were vanished, their bodies left in the dirt as a warning to anyone who dared defy them. "I thought you were safe here," Eli muttered, more to himself than to her. "I thought so too," she replied, her voice cracking. "But they found out where I am. They'll come for me, and they'll burn everything down if they have to." Eli's chest tightened. He hadn't wanted to know, hadn't wanted to get involved. But now, there was no turning back. "I didn't just leave," Mary said, her eyes looking straight into his. "I ran, from a debt I couldn't pay, from a father who sold me to them. They're coming because I owe them, and they don't forgive." Eli's world seemed to narrow in that moment. His mind flashed back to his own battles, his own debts, the things he had run from, the faces of those he had betrayed, and those who had betrayed him. It was all too familiar, but this was worse. The stakes weren't just survival anymore. They were life or death. And now, the man who had lived alone for so long found himself caught in a web he couldn't escape. "They won't stop," Mary continued, her voice breaking. "They'll keep coming until they get what they want." Eli stood still, his mind racing. The threat was closing in fast, and they had no time to prepare. The feeling of helplessness was foreign to him. The fight was always supposed to come after the decision to protect, but now he was forced to act before the real danger had even fully revealed itself. The land had gone still, as if waiting for the inevitable. "You're not alone anymore," Eli said quietly. The decision made for him in that instant. The tension between them had shifted, and now it was no longer just about survival. It was about saving each other before it was too late. The days that followed were filled with tension, but also a strange kind of quiet camaraderie. The threat of the gang's arrival hung like a dark cloud over them, but in the small moments, it was as though the world outside had disappeared. Eli and Mary didn't speak of the future. They didn't need to. There was something in the air between them, something unspoken but deeply understood. Eli spent the mornings in the barn, tending to the horses, preparing for the worst. Mary would join him in the afternoons, her hands moving skillfully through the tasks she'd learned from years of necessity. She cooked, cleaned, and did the things she knew how to do. But there was always something different in the way she moved now, slower, more deliberate. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was, for the first time, allowing herself to live. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eli handed her the rifle. Her hands shook slightly as she took it, the weight of the metal foreign to her. He didn't speak, but his eyes were steady, instructing her without words. Mary looked down at the rifle, her brow furrowing as she examined it, unsure. I don't know how." Eli nodded, stepping closer, his presence calm, unhurried. "You'll learn. We don't have time to waste." He showed her the proper stance, his hands guiding hers as she held the gun. It felt heavy in her grasp, but she didn't let go. "Pull back the hammer. Steady your aim," Eli said softly, his voice rough with something unspoken. He moved behind her, his hands brushing hers as he adjusted her posture. For a long moment they stood in silence, both focused on the distant target. Eli could feel the tension radiating off her, the fear, the uncertainty. But there was also something else. Determination. She wasn't afraid of learning, of fighting. She was afraid of what she might have to lose. "Take a breath," Eli said, his voice softer now. Mary inhaled slowly, then exhaled, her finger tightening on the trigger. The shot rang out, piercing the stillness of the evening. It missed. She winced. "You'll get it next time," Eli murmured, his hand on her shoulder, an unspoken promise hanging between them. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he placed the rifle back in her hands, his touch lingering just a moment longer than necessary. The next day, as Mary prepared the evening meal, Eli watched her from the doorway. She moved with a kind of quiet confidence now, the kind that came from surviving, from learning. She wasn't just cooking to fill their stomachs anymore. She was creating something from nothing, building a small piece of comfort in a world that had given her little. She looked up, catching his gaze, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was warm, full of understanding. He saw in her eyes something that mirrored his own experience. She wasn't just broken. She was a survivor. As they sat down to eat, the world outside felt far away. The fire crackled softly in the corner, the only sound filling the room. It wasn't peace. They both knew that. But in that moment, it was as close to peace as either of them had ever known. And as the quiet settled around them, Eli allowed himself a brief moment of hope. He wasn't alone anymore. Neither of them were. They were two broken people, but they were together. And somehow, That felt like enough. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the land, when the first sounds of engines broke the silence. At first, it was distant, a hum on the horizon, barely noticeable. But it grew louder, closer. Eli felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. His grip tightened on the rifle leaning against the cabin wall, the weight of it a silent reminder of what was coming. Mary had been quiet all day, watching the sky, listening to the distant growl of the engines. She knew. She could feel it too. Eli stepped outside, his boots crunching against the gravel as he moved toward the front of the cabin. The wind shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of gasoline and dust. "They're here," Mary said softly, her voice strained, like a thread ready to snap. Eli didn't respond. Here was nothing left to say. His gaze stayed fixed on the distant road where the black silhouettes of men appeared. They were on horseback, their faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats, their movements deliberate and slow, like hunters closing in on their prey. Eli's jaw tightened. The gang had arrived. There was no more time to prepare. His heart hammered in his chest, the adrenaline rising, but his mind was calm. "They're not taking her," he thought, and he knew deep down that he would do whatever it took to keep that promise. He turned to Mary, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low, but there was no comfort in it. It was a command, not a plea. Mary stepped forward, her hands holding a rifle she had grown accustomed to over the past few days. Her eyes were steely, hardened by fear and pain. "I'm not staying in there while they come for me." Eli met her gaze for a long moment. The air between them was thick with unspoken understanding, but also with the weight of what was about to happen. There was no turning back now. The gang approached the cabin, the sound of hooves echoing louder as they drew nearer. Eli stood firm, his hand steady on the rifle. His mind flickered to the faces of the men who had once been his comrades in arms, the men who had fought and died for nothing. And here, now, he was fighting for something more precious than any war had ever been. As the first of the men dismounted, Eli stepped forward, his rifle raised. "You'll have to go through me," he said, his voice cold. The leader of the gang, a towering man with a scar running down his cheek, smirked. "You think you can stop us, old man?" His voice was a guttural growl full of contempt. "She's ours. You don't get to keep her." Eli's fingers tightened around the trigger. He wasn't just fighting for Mary. He was fighting for a chance at redemption, for a life that wasn't ruled by regret. But then, just as the tension reached its peak, a twist hit him. Mary stepped out from behind him, her rifle raised, aimed directly at the leader. Her face was set, her eyes full of fire. "I've already told you, she's not yours," Mary said, her voice steady, but fierce. The gang leader hesitated, his eyes flicking between Mary and Eli. "You're willing to die for this?" he sneered. Without hesitation, Eli moved forward, his finger steady on the trigger. He wasn't going to let them take her, not after everything she had been through, not after what they had shared. If it meant his life for hers, then so be it. But before the confrontation could escalate any further, the leader made an unexpected move. He raised his hand, signaling the rest of the gang to lower their weapons. "You're a stubborn one," he said with a smirk. "I admire that. But don't think for a second this is over. We'll be back." As the gang turned and started to mount their horses, Eli's breath came out in a ragged sigh. His heart still pounded in his chest, but it wasn't over yet. The threat had retreated, but it wasn't gone. Mary lowered her rifle, her eyes wide with the realization of what almost happened. She looked at Eli, her face softening. For a moment, there was silence between them. The weight of what they had both almost lost hung in the air. "I won't let them take you," Eli said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. He didn't have to say anything more. Mary didn't reply, but she stepped closer to him, her gaze meeting his with a quiet understanding. They were both scarred, both marked by the past, but they were still standing, together, and that was all that mattered now. The gang had backed off, but Eli knew it was only a matter of time before they returned, and when they did, they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. But Eli was prepared to risk everything, even his life, to make sure Mary never had to face that again. The sun had long set, and the cold crept into the cabin, the silence more oppressive now than it had been before. Mary and Eli stood side by side, staring into the dark, their backs to the door that had once shielded them from the world outside. The gang had retreated, leaving only the faintest echoes of their departure. No more gunfire, no more threats. But the relief that should have come with their leaving was hollow. It felt like a fleeting victory in a war that would never end. Eli's breath was shallow, his hand still gripping the rifle, his fingers stiff with tension. Mary hadn't said much after the confrontation. She had retreated into herself again, her eyes distant, lost in the quiet aftermath. The stillness that followed the chaos was deafening. Eli turned away from the window, his boots scraping across the wooden floor. His chest ached, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It wasn't supposed to end like this, not like it had with his comrades, not like the things he had seen before. But there had been no other choice. The night dragged on, the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. It was the kind of night where memories came alive, crawling under the skin like old ghosts. Eli had lived long enough to know that no matter how far you ran, the past always caught up with you. But now, standing in the quiet cabin with Mary, he felt the heaviness of the years weighing on him. The regrets, the choices, the people he had failed. Then there was a sound, a knock at the door, soft but unmistakable. Eli's body went rigid, his fingers curling around the rifle. His instincts flared. They hadn't made it this far just to have it all fall apart now. Mary looked up, her eyes wide, her chest rising and falling with a nervous breath. She didn't say anything, but her gaze locked with his, pleading for reassurance. Eli didn't move at first, just stood there, listening to the silence that enveloped them. The wind outside seemed to stop, the world holding its breath. With slow, deliberate movements, I walked to the door, the creak of the floorboards loud in the quiet. He paused, hand resting on the handle, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't know what to expect. The door swung open. And there, standing on the other side, was the leader of the gang. His face was grim, his hand resting on his holstered gun, but his posture was different. There was no fire in his eyes now, no sneer on his lips, only something strange, maybe regret, maybe surrender. I should have never. The words broke off, and the man didn't finish. He didn't need to. Without saying a word, Eli stepped aside, his rifle lowering just enough to show he wasn't here to fight. The gang leader didn't hesitate this time, crossing the threshold without a second glance back. I came to give you something, the leader muttered. A promise. His voice was hollow, empty. Eli didn't reply, didn't need to. The promise was meaningless now. The gang was gone, their power broken, at least for the moment. The leader didn't stay long, just placed something heavy on the table, a pouch of coins, and turned to leave. The door closed with a soft click behind him, and the weight of it all settled in the space between them. Mary didn't speak. She didn't need to. They stood there in the quiet, the cabin suddenly feeling even more empty than before, as if everything had already been decided. They weren't safe, not truly, but the storm had passed, for now. The world outside was still harsh, unforgiving, but in the moment, it didn't matter. They had survived, together. Eli turned away from the door and looked at Mary, his eyes softening. His shoulders, once tense with the weight of the fight, finally relaxed. She walked toward him, not saying anything but taking his hand. There was nothing more to say. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was a comfort. As the fire flickered low, and the world outside fell into a deep, cold hush, They stood together in the stillness. Weeks turned into months, and the seasons shifted across the land like pages of a forgotten book. The cabin, once a lace of tension and fear, now seemed warmer, more alive. The silence between Eli and Mary had become something familiar, comfortable. They had grown into each other, their presence a quiet companionship forged from the fires of shared hardship. Eli's movements had slowed, his shoulders no longer burdened by the weight of past regrets. He no longer carried the ghosts of war in his eyes. He had learned, in the stillness of this new life, that peace didn't come with the absence of danger or violence. It came in moments of quiet connection, in the small things. Mary, too, had changed. The woman who had walked into his life with the shadows of abuse and betrayal clinging to her every step had learned to trust again. She found solace in the simple tasks, tending to the fire, preparing meals, caring for the land. She no longer flinched at every shadow or at the distant sound of a horse's hoofbeats. The fear that had once dominated her heart had given way to something else. Strength. The strength to stay, to build, to create a life in the very place she had once thought would be her grave. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they sat together on the porch, the cool wind brushing against their faces. The cabin, now more than just a shelter, had become a home, a place where the past was no longer an enemy, but a quiet whisper in the back of their minds. Eli looked over at Mary, her face softened by the fading light, her eyes clear, free of the weight they once carried. He thought about the years that had passed, the battles fought, the promises kept, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that they had truly found peace. As the stars began to fill the sky, Eli stood and walked toward the small grave near the cabin. It was unmarked, just a simple mound of earth, the grave of a life that had been, and lost but never forgotten. He placed a single wildflower on it, a quiet gesture, a symbol of the new life they had built. Mary joined him, standing silently by his side.